Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 8th Keynote Plenary session in this conference. I am Dr. Shaham Al-Alloush, and I'll be your host for this session. And in fact, I'm glad that I'm chairing this session of Professor Nicholas Kinnable. I know Professor Nicholas at a personal level, and I think that everyone who works in architecture and or urban planning in Oman come across his name in a way or another. So we're looking for enriching speech from him. The session will go as follows. I will introduce Professor Nicholas, then he will have his presentation. Then we'll have our questions and answer sessions. So during Professor Nicholas's presentation, please feel free to post your question either in the question and answer box or the chat box, whatever you feel more comfortable with. And later I will read the question and Professor Nicholas will kindly reply to those questions and discuss the issues further. Nicholas Kinnable is an architect and was a professor of architecture and urban design at the German University of Technology in Oman, that is affiliated to RWTH Aachen in Germany. He is currently working at the Ministry of Housing and Urban Planning in Oman. He studied in Berlin, Singapore, the Netherlands, and gained professional experience in the office of Reem Koolhaas in Rotterdam and Toyo Aito in Tokyo. Nicholas received various awards for his built projects as well as competition entries. These works were widely published and exhibited, for example, in the German Architectural Museum in Frankfurt, German Architecture Center and German Architecture Center in Berlin. Nicholas worked for the Bauhaus Dessous Foundation and as a consultant for GIZ, which is the German International Corporation in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to develop the country's first local development plan with a participatory approach to urban planning. During his 2 years as a guest professor at Addis Ababa University and as part of the World Bank funded German development project, he also consulted the Ministry of Housing on strategies for managing urban expansions and developing appropriate and affordable housing typologies. The ongoing Geotech Eco House project, a pioneering net zero energy building in Oman, received the Oman Green Award for Education, Special Commendation in 2014, Best Sustainable Project in North Africa and Middle East, and Best Project Design and Best Architect at the Dussair Construction Awards in 2015. And his research on identity through efficiency got the Best Paper Award at the previous version of this conference, the Comfort at the Extremes conference in 2019 in Dubai. Nicholas is a co-author of the Green Building Guidelines for a large oil company in Oman and a member of the technical as well as the steering committee of the new Oman National Building Code project, in which he recently co-authored a white paper on energy efficiency and sustainability of cities and buildings in Oman, together with experts from the government, industry, and academia. Recently, he was selected as a nominator for the Aga Khan Award for Architecture and also identified by the Royal Institute of British Architects, the Gulf chapter, as one of the 100 architecture leaders in the region. So we're very happy and glad to have Professor Nicholas with us today. And without any further ado, please, Professor Nicholas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chaham, for this introduction. And I would like to highlight that I'll speak as a private person today, not in any role or professional setup. I will change from my usual habit of talking in free speech because the topic that I've prepared for this keynote is a little complex, and I think it's better that I read the text. So dear colleagues, Thank you very much for inviting me to give this keynote address to the biannual Comfort at the Extremes CATE conference. I clearly remember the first time I got to know about the CATE conference series. It was on a leisurely boat cruise through Victoria Harbour in Hong Kong during one evening of the Passive Low Energy Architecture, or PLEA conference in 2018, when I met Professor Sue Rohoff, and she told me about these events, but also about her personal connection to and interest in Oman. It is much appreciated that Sue and her team brought this conference to Oman this year, and I would like to congratulate and thank the colleagues from Sultan Qaboos University for organizing this event. Here in Oman, an extremely fast urbanization is ongoing. Its housing stock has doubled over the past decade and will double again over the next 2 decades. Such rapid transformation happened in Europe in the late 19th century when the metropoles of the West were born. It happened in the late 20th century in Asia when the metropoles of the East came up. It is happening in this region at the moment, and it will further continue to happen to even greater extents in the metropoles in waiting along the Indian Ocean coast, for example, in East Africa. The CATE conference's title, Comfort at the Extremes, points at the conditions of extreme temperatures. But in a wider sense, it could also be interpreted in terms of the extremes of the speed of urban development or the extremes of economic capacities, or rather the lack thereof. The metropoles in the making that I'm trying to bring to the foreground here are at the crossroads of all of these extremes. The future megacities that are evolving in regions not too far from here are very hot, grow very fast, and it should be added, are not very affluent. They are extreme in multiple senses and therefore are in even more need for the humanistic anchor that this conference series sets: people's comfort and their well-being in the built environment. In this context, I think we can say that CATE 21 is at the right place at the right time. A view on the history of this conference would help to assess where the discourse on comfort comes from, where it currently is, and where it might go to. Being only a one-time participant of the conference series by attending CATE 19 in Dubai, I'm obviously not an insider of this network of scientists. However, for an outsider, the enormous achievements of this network in progressing the understanding of comfort were palpable at the Dubai event 2 years ago, and even more so are impressive when reading about the history of the conference series over the past 50 years. The roots of this conference series are, as we read on its website, in 1972. For architects, this year is especially significant because, as the architecture historian Charles Jenks wrote, quote, "Modern architecture died in St. Louis, Missouri on July 15, 1972 at 3:32 p.m. or thereabouts, when the infamous Prut-Ego scheme, or rather several of its slab blocks, were given the final coup de grace by dynamite, as we can see on the photo below. This event of blowing up a modernist housing scheme because of its failure to provide a comfortable built environment for people was symbolic for the turning point from modernism to reflexive modernism, or in other words, a paradigm shift in problem solving from generalizing one size fits all to specific differentiated solutions. The history of this conference series since 1972 echoes this development. From the first conference on thermal comfort to what later became a series of 11 Windsor conferences, named after the venue in the UK, and eventually the 2 international Comfort at the Extremes CATE conferences in Dubai in 2019 and now in Oman in 2021. The participants established an innovative view on the concept of comfort by introducing the concept of adaptive thermal comfort, only to then move the center of discourse even further away from, quote, the technicalities of heating and cooling systems to, quote again, the needs, desires, and behavior of the occupants of buildings. The approach to comfort became less technocratic and more humanistic. Today, thanks to the achievements of this conference series, the concept of comfort in the built environment is people-oriented and, we should highlight that, culture-specific. While the dissemination of this approach to the practice of planning and building is still a huge task, the interesting question after a successful half-century is, what comes next? Will the changes that are required in today's challenged world come from generating even more scientific knowledge on this particular question, laudable as this may be? Will more, quote, listening to science, as we hear in the Fridays for Future movement, make a significant enough difference? And even if this would be pursued, what then? Or is the actual playing field for progress elsewhere? To approach this question, I would like to draw your attention to an event that I believe is of utmost significance to our discourse and mission that we are all trying to advance here at the CATE conference. Half a year ago, on the 24th of March 2021, the First Senate of the Federal Constitutional Court of the Federal Republic of Germany made a groundbreaking ruling. I assume that this ruling did not draw too much attention outside of Germany, and therefore I believe it is worth putting it forward at this event here today, because it is such a game-changing decision that should make us rethink what it is that we are actually working on. The matter is a bit complex, especially for us as non-lawyers, and therefore I would like to explain it step by step by breaking it down into digestible pieces. Step 1. What is the key question of this court ruling that I'm trying to bring your attention to here? The key question of this case is about the compliance of two acts. The compliance of the Federal Climate Change Act with the basic law of Germany. Let me briefly introduce each of the two legislations that are being discussed here so that we can understand the court's verdict better and assess and evaluate its significance. So this could potentially be very boring because I'm reading out a bit of legal text. But I want to assure you it's worth concentrating on this because there is a very significant message in here. So let us understand one side of this verdict, the Climate Change Act. On the one side of the case is the Climate Change Act of 2019, which is a key national legislation that governs climate targets towards 2030, as well as leading the country to climate neutrality. These targets echo the nationally determined contributions, NDCs, that are derived from the Paris Agreement. The nature of this act is that it is focused on operations and implementation. Basically, it deals with quantities over time, and I believe that many countries have such a legislation. Let us look at the example from Germany. Section 3, that is important for the court's verdict that we look at, says the national climate targets are: emissions of greenhouse gases shall be gradually reduced in comparison with their levels in the year 1990. The reduction to be achieved by the target year 2030 shall be at least 55%. We've read this often in newspapers. We also know that by 2040 it should be 80%, and finally by 2050 it should be 100%. In order to make this section implementable, there is another section which I'll not go into detail that gives certain CO2 emissions targets for different sectors and industries. So let us look at the other side of this court verdict to understand the tension that needs to be resolved. So we are now looking at the basic law of Germany, which is the country's constitution. The nature of the constitution's articles is that they state principles, some of which even have timeless qualities and are under an eternity clause, which means that they can never be overridden. We are looking at two articles, and the latter is under this eternity clause. Article 2, that matters in our discussion on climate change, and that might surprise you or not, is Article 2, personal freedoms. It reads, every person shall have the right to free development of his personality insofar as he does not violate the rights of others or offend against the constitutional order or moral law. Now we need to find the connection to climate change, which we find in Article 20A, which is about the protection of the natural foundations of life and animals. It says, mindful also of its responsibility towards future generations, the state shall protect the natural foundations of life and animals by legislation and, in accordance with law and justice, by executive and juridical action, all within the framework of the constitutional order. Okay, after this stretch, now we need to see how these two components, the Climate Change Act with its targets for CO2 emissions, is related to the basic law and the question of personal freedom. And here it gets really interesting. Let us look at the court ruling. The case that the court had to decide upon was whether the state's actions as stipulated in the Climate Change Act are sufficient to prevent a fundamental change in living conditions, which would in turn infringe on the personal freedoms as stipulated in the basic law. So the question is if the Climate Change Act, according to the Paris Agreement, is enough, or whether it's actually against the Constitution because it's not good enough. And interestingly, the court concluded that the Climate Change Act and its target were simply not good enough to ensure that future generations would be able to enact their rights of personal freedoms. I'll repeat this sentence because it's key to our understanding of the situation we are in. So the court concluded that the Climate Change Act and its targets were simply not good enough to ensure that future generations would be able to enact their rights of personal freedoms. The key point is that the court took an intergenerational perspective on this question and argued that because today's failures to tackle climate change would significantly limit tomorrow's options to act, the future generation would have to carry a disproportionate burden of mitigating climate change, and this would infringe on their personal freedoms, which are guaranteed in the basic law. Now, I will quote one more passage from the explanation of this ruling, and this is the original text of the court. It's not authored by me or anyone else here. So what are the key considerations here? Quote, and please bear with me, it's only another few minutes and we'll come to the final point here. The challenged provisions, the court writes, have an advanced interference-like effect on the freedom comprehensively protected by the basic law. The possibilities to exercise this freedom in ways that directly or indirectly involve CO2 emissions come up against constitutional limits, because seen from today's perspective, CO2 emissions make a largely irreversible contribution towards global warming, and under constitutional law, the legislator may not allow climate change to progress ad infinitum without taking action. Provisions that allow for CO2 emissions in the present time constitute an irreversible legal threat to future freedom, because every amount of CO2 that is allowed today narrows the remaining options for reducing emissions in compliance with Article 20A of the Constitution. Any exercise of freedom involving CO2 emissions will therefore be subject to increasingly stringent and indeed constitutionally required restrictions. It is true that any exercise of freedom involving CO2 emissions would have to be essentially prohibited at some point anyway in order to halt climate change, because global warming can only be prevented if anthropogenic concentrations of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere stop rising. However, if much of the CO2 budget were already depleted by 2030, there would be a heightened risk of serious losses of freedom, because there would then be a shorter time frame for the technological and social developments required to enable today's still heavily CO2-oriented lifestyle to make the transition to climate-neutral behavior in a way that respects freedom. Now, this is a heavy text, but it is the text of a court ruling. It is not an essay, it's not a comment, it's not something we read in a daily newspaper. It is a verdict issued by the highest court of the country. Now, what is the conclusion? The conclusion is that this verdict is a game changer. While the discourse on climate change and its consequences often and necessarily revolves around quantitative issues, discussing, for example, the tolerable degrees of temperature rise or the reference levels of CO2 emissions, introducing new measurements for buildings' performances or people's thermal comfort, this court verdict reframes the question and breaks through from natural sciences to social sciences, from physics to politics, from emissions to freedoms, from the planet's conditions back to the fundamentals of our conditio humana. Sometimes it seems that we need to lift our heads from our desks and screens and see what our pursuit is all about in the end. Yes, we are striving to achieve better comfort for people in the built environment while protecting the natural environment, especially in extreme climatic conditions. But as we've learned from the mentioned verdict, the actual target is no longer quantifiable. While we are working for people's comfort, we need to acknowledge that eventually it's also about freedom. It is about our freedom, and especially that of the next generation, a freedom that can only be assured if changes to the practice of planning and building our environment are seriously introduced and enforced. Listening to science, quote, by itself will not change enough. Rather, we need to be focusing at governance. So in the end, I believe here in the last keynote address to this 3-day conference, and with an extended view on our mission in mind, we might productively speculate if the motto for the next conference, held in 2 years' time from now, CATE 23, might have to change to become GATE 23, governance at the extremes, or even FATE 23, freedom at the extremes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Nicholas, for this enriching presentation. Actually, you managed to take us to a whole different domain that's rarely touched upon under the comfort theme. I think what after comfort is, according to your presentation, is to address the issue of the balance between the controversial issue of personal freedom and what the elite of the society think is beneficial to the whole population. And this paradoxical issue has been discussed for ages, and no doubt that governance is a major component of protecting our planet. However, maybe awareness and enhancing personal morals toward our planet, toward reduction of the CO2 emission based on personal initiatives, based on incentives, could be a parallel line that can enhance and actually support the governance, the significant governance part. I pretty much fancy the freedom at the extreme, FATE 23. That's actually inspiring and futuristic. I move now to the questions. We have several questions. Start with Professor Suraouf. She's asking, do the judge in Germany have a political bent at Trump, as Trump's Supreme Court judges obviously did have?
No, they don't. They are sent to this position on a party ticket, but in a kind of what is the word for it? In a consensual manner. And the court is very independent, and is well balanced. And to answer your question and to extend on it, the court ruling has given homework to the government to reassess their climate policies, to just be better and take it more serious and stop kicking the can down the road and waiting for others to do it later. And I think it's very significant that this comes from a court of this height.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Professor Su has another couple of questions.
Please,
Maybe it would be useful, since we have time, to I asked the administrator, our administrator, to sign Professor Su as a panelist so she can ask her question herself and discuss this issue further. Maybe Dr. Muhammad, if you hear me, can you assign Professor Susan Rauf as a panelist? Brilliant. Professor Susan.
Yes. No,
nice to have you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So in your German courts, you say they are balanced and unbiased, but in Trump's courts, they obviously are partisan. So if laws are decided by judges who may have one view or an opposite view, does that mean that that laws actually only exist as a construct of those who create them, and that if laws are that, then rights may or may not exist according to who decides that they will?
Okay. Now, the court does not make the law. The court only checks if the different legislatures are in accordance with the Constitution. So that is why they play the ball back with this verdict to the government, and then in that sense also to the parliament, to come up with something better. But they do not author a law. They are just referees.
If they can deliberate on the validity of a law, anyway, I'm just questioning the idea of whether rights really exist, or do we live in a world in which the only thing that overrides rights is power and money? And if that's so, how does one fight power and money?
Okay, that is okay. That's very fundamental. In the example we have in front of us here, I would say it's a hopeful example because it shows that the Constitutional Court, as kind of it can't be more institutional than that, is almost subversive. And that is an interesting situation. Now, you could say that is also dangerous, but the subversive perspective, if you want to call it that, comes from the Constitution. It comes from this very fundamental idea of whether what we are doing today is actually within our rights to enact our personal freedom at the cost of the next generation. And I wanted to bring this forward because I know of no other example where it's so clearly stated that what's going on today is simply wrong.
No, I think it's a brilliant example, and I'm sure others in the audience will also have been impressed by that. But just as your judges can have come down with a slightly left-wing subversive view, presumably other judges might come down with a right-wing subversive view as well. I'm just saying the fragility of law in the balance of power is interesting.
That I fully agree. It is a very thin line where you might want to accept this overruling, so to say, or whether you might oppose it. However, in this case, it's, you know, there's another case in the Netherlands where, because of their CO2 budget, you could say, that was not balanced enough a high court ruled that now there's a speed limit on the highways, so that the reduction of CO2 emissions from that side can be balanced with another part of the budget. So again, you see how the legal, if you take the legal commitments of the Paris Agreement seriously and not just as decoration, if you take it serious, you get to very drastic measures which are in the right direction. But it's interesting when people take these points up and spell it out and say what it means.
I'm very interested in this, the mechanisms by which we are going to impact really radical change on the world. Because what we've seen in the West is in Europe, we've had 3 decades of, since 1992, of huge investment in energy efficiency in buildings, right? Yeah. And yet the buildings year on year use more and more energy, and they are being pushed by building regulations. And if one's very cynical, you could say that the building regulations are written by mechanical engineers who, through the legal systems and regulations and standards, enforce ever more equipment into buildings. And right. They are a profession who also are paid according to how much equipment goes into a building. So, I mean, in the wrong hands, I'm not saying this has happened, I'm saying it could happen. In the wrong hands, the law becomes an instrument of our own destruction.
Unfortunately, yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Susan Rauf. If I may, we have another question from Eleni Tracada, if I'm pronouncing this correct. She says, strong message, Nicholas. Many thanks for mentioning human freedom, but how do we get this message to our students in the built environment? We have issues with what governments decide about environmental solutions to face climatic change, and awareness of people communicating with scholars, future professionals in a variety of sectors. So basically, she's asking how we deliver this message to students and professionals with the government, having the government view, with a certain view in terms of how to face climatic change.
I think the concepts of personal freedom and so are not very difficult to understand and to explain, and they are very near to everyone in their understanding of the world. And therefore, sometimes it might be refreshing to look at the same problem from another discipline. And that's also why I try to put this topic here together for the keynote today, to say we can look at comfort from a legal perspective or from a philosophical perspective. And so if you ask me about, say, a didactic question, how would students understand that better? I would say change of perspectives are always a good way to understand a complex issue, because you have more than one approach to it then.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. We don't have further questions, but if I may ask you, if we want to reflect what you have presented today into Oman context, or say GCC region, how do you see that? How do you see this balance can be achieved? If we want to put this in context, CO2 emissions targets between Germany and Oman, or the Gulf region, where are we?
Well, I would say as a German citizen, I can comment on the German situation, and I know it in more detail. And therefore I would say it's up to others to reflect on this. But if people are interested, the court verdict, for example, is translated into English. You can find it on the internet. There's a bunch of articles around this in international newspapers. So it's possible to read about it in English.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Professor Susan Rauf is commenting, I think forming a fellowship for change as key, as we have a comfortable fellowship, or the extinction rebellion has a fellowship. Through our friendship, we gain strength to enact change. Yes, indeed, fellowship is a obvious way to do it. Thank you very much. Many thanks. I think that's all. If we don't have any further questions, I would like to deeply thank Professor Nicholas for this enlightening and enriching presentation. And thank you very much, Nicholas.
Welcome, and thank you again for the invitation and for bringing this conference here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye all. Bye-bye.